Hey everybody, Nick Espinosa, your chief security fanatic here, and today we actually have to talk about Uber because I've been saying for years Uber is a horrible, horrible company, the ride-sharing company. Now we've got some proof, thanks to The Guardian and others. This is huge news, and pay attention if you are a Uber passenger. I have not been using Uber for years out of protest for some of what they've done, but it's really coming in focus now. Now, I am very heavily cribbing from, going to be quoting and or paraphrasing a ton of this until I get into my own notes and my own opinions here from an article in The Guardian by Harry Davies, Simon Goodley, Felicity Lawrence, Paul Lewis, and Lisa O'Carroll. Guys, you did one heck of a job on this, and I'm really glad you're on our side. And I quote directly to start this off from their article: a leaked trove of confidential files has revealed the inside story of how the tech giant Uber flouted laws, duped police, exploited violence against drivers, and secretly lobbied governments during its aggressive global expansion. This is crazy. Now, this is an unprecedented leak of more than 124,000 documents, which The Guardian and others are calling the Uber files. And obviously, this lays bare the ethically questionable practices that essentially fueled their transformation into basically one of the largest and most visible companies in the world. Now, The Guardian led a global investigation into these leaked files, sharing data with media organizations around the world via the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. More than 180 journalists and 40 media outlets, including Le Monde in France, the Washington Post here in the United States, and the BBC out of the UK, will basically in the coming days be publishing a series of investigative reports basically about Uber, meaning this is a coordinated effort. As you are going through what is 124,000 documents, that takes a ton of work. Now, this leak spans a 5-year period when Uber was run by its co-founder, Travis Kalanick, who tried to force basically Uber, the cab hailing service, into cities around the world, even if it meant breaching laws and regulations governing taxis in those jurisdictions. Now, the files also cover Uber's operations across 40 countries during a period in which it basically became that global behemoth, bulldozing cab-hailing services in basically many cities. I mean, I can land virtually anywhere, and I can go get a cab, like a yellow cab in New York, or I can get an Uber. Sometimes I can get a Lyft, but Uber obviously is the more ubiquitous outside of the cabs, and I usually go for cabs specifically because this is proving a lot of what we have just collected over the years. This was a great whistleblower. Now, during the fierce global backlash, I should say, the data shows how Uber tried to shore up support by discreetly courting prime ministers, presidents, billionaires, oligarchs, and media barons. That's according to The Guardian. Now, leaked messages suggest that Uber executives were at the same time under no illusions that they were basically breaking the law in a lot of these countries, with one executive joking that they had become pirates and another one conceding, "We're just effing illegal," obviously spelling it out. That is a huge thing. We'll be talking about that in a couple minutes here. But basically today, Mark McGann, Uber's former chief lobbyist for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, came forward to identify himself as the source of leaked data. Quote, "It's my duty to speak up and help governments and parliamentarians right some fundamental wrongs. Morally, I had no choice in the matter." Now, this cache of files spans between 2013 and 2017, includes more than 83,000 emails, iMessages, and WhatsApp messages, including often frank and unvarnished communications between CEO Kalanick and his top executives. In one exchange, Kalanick dismisses concerns from other executives that sending Uber drivers to protest in France put them at risk of violence from angry opponents. Quote, "I think it's worth it. Violence guarantees success," according to Kalanick. That is a quote from the documents. In a statement, Kalanick's spokesperson said that he, quote, "never suggested that Uber should take advantage of violence at the expense of driver safety," end quote. And any suggestion that he was involved in any activity is certainly false. Now, we're going to get into that because there is more information than just that simple statement. The leak also contains text, and this is interesting, between Kalanick and Emmanuel Macron, who secretly helped the company in France when Macron was actually the economy minister. This is before he was elected president, allowing Uber frequent and direct access to him and his staff. Macron, like as I mentioned, who is now the French president, appears to have gone to extraordinary lengths to help Uber, even telling the company that he had brokered a secret quote-unquote deal with its opponents in the French cabinet. That's crazy. Now, privately, Uber executives expressed barely disguised disdain for other elected officials who were less receptive to the company's business model. So after, for example, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who was the mayor of Hamburg at the time, pushed back against Uber's lobbyists, basically, he was insisting that the drivers get paid minimum wage according to German law. An executive told his colleagues that Mr. Scholz was, and I quote, a real comedian. When then U.S. Vice President, now President Joseph R. Biden, who was a supporter of Uber at the time, was late to a meeting with the company at the World Economic Forum at Davos, Kalanick texted a colleague, quote, "I've had my people let him know that every minute late he is one less minute he will have with me." What a jerk. Now, after that's the vice president of the United States. I mean, talk about all right. Anyway, after meeting Kalanick, Biden, then Vice President Biden, appears to have amended his prepared speech at Davos to refer to as CEOs whose company would give millions of workers, quote, freedom to work as many hours as they wish, manage their own lives as they wish. Now, in a statement responding to the leak, Uber admitted to quote-unquote mistakes and missteps, but said it had transformed in 2017 under the leadership of its current CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, and I'm probably mispronouncing that. I deeply apologize. Now, Kalanick's spokesperson also said that Uber's expansion initiatives were, quote, led by over 100 leaders in dozens of countries around the world and at all times under the direct oversight with the full approval of Uber's robust legal policy and compliance groups. In other words, everybody's to blame here, not just Kalanick, but we'll get to that because above and beyond this, I did my homework, as I've been doing my homework on Uber for years. Now, from Moscow to Johannesburg, bankrolled unprecedented venture capital funding, Uber heavily basically subsidized journeys, basically seducing drivers and passengers onto the app with incentives and pricing models that would not be sustainable, basically meaning they were subsidizing their own stuff to make it look palatable to basically continue to increase the driver percentage here. Uber also undercut established taxi and cab markets and put pressure on governments to rewrite their laws to help pave the way for an app-based gig economy model of basically, of Uber that obviously proliferated across the world. Now we are living in the gig economy, and I basically went and looked up the numbers. We'll be talking about that too. Now, in a bid to quell the fierce backlash against the company and win changes to taxi and labor laws, Uber planned to spend just an amazing $90 million in 2016 on lobbying and public relations. Its strategy was often basically going over the heads of city mayors and local transport authorities and right to the seat of power, meaning why talk to the mayor when you can talk to the president? In addition to meeting then Vice President Biden at Davos, Uber executives met face-to-face with Macron, obviously the president of France, the Irish Prime Minister Enda Kenny, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the time, and George Osborne, who was the United Kingdom's chancellor at that time as well. A note from the meeting portrayed Osborne as a quote-unquote strong advocate. Now, in a statement, Mr. Osborne said that it was the explicit policy of the government at the time to meet with global tech firms and, quote, persuade them to invest in Britain and create jobs here. Now, while the Davos sit-down, I should say, with Osborne was declared, the data reveals that 6 other UK Tory cabinet ministers had meetings with Uber that were not actually disclosed, apparently against UK law. It is unclear if these meetings should have been declared, and there you go. Lobbying rules in the UK obviously should have applied, but they're not sure. Now, the documents also indicate that Uber was adept at finding unofficial routes to power, applying influence through friends or intermediaries, and seeking out encounters with politicians, which aides and officials were not present, meaning no paper trail. Nobody would be there to witness the conversation. It also enlisted the backing of powerful figures in places like Russia, Italy, Germany, and others by offering them prized financial stakes in the startup and turning them into quote-unquote strategic investors. Now, and in a bid to shape policy debates, they also paid prominent academics hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce research that supported the claims about the benefits of its economic model. That in and of itself is probably going to be looked at by the FTC, meaning if they were having or paying financial analysis for basically to gin up the stats to say this works to entice basically investors, they could have been committing fraud. I'm curious to see where that one is going to go. Again, most of what I'm saying here is straight up paraphrasing, this Guardian article. Just a fantastic article. And for the record, I'm not reading the whole thing. I mean, this was very, very in depth. I'm so looking forward to Le Monde and BBC and Washington Post and the others as well. Now, despite a well-financed, dogged lobbying operation, I can't even read my notes, Uber's effort had mixed results. In some places, Uber succeeded in persuading governments to rewrite laws with lasting effects, but elsewhere the company found itself blocked by entrenched taxi industries, outgunned by local cab-hailing rivals, or opposed by left-wing politicians who simply refused to budge on it, meaning cabs oftentimes will have unions in some areas, and the union wasn't having Uber for obvious reasons. Now, when faced with opposition, Uber sought to turn it to its advantage, seizing upon basically these issues to fuel the narrative that its technology was disrupting antiquated transport systems and therefore would allow them to urge governments to reform their laws to modernize. Now, as Uber launched across India, for example, Kalanick's top executive in Asia urged managers to focus on driving growth even when, quote, fires start to burn. Another quote, no, this is a normal part of Uber's business. Embrace the chaos. It means you're doing something meaningful. Now, Kalanick appears to basically put that ethos into practice in January of 2016, when Uber's attempts to upend markets in Europe led to angry protests in Belgium, Spain, Italy, and France from taxi drivers who feared, obviously, for their livelihood. Now, amid taxi strikes and riots in Paris, Kalanick ordered French executives to retaliate by encouraging Uber drivers to stage a counter-protest with mass civil disobedience, warned that doing this basically was risking putting Uber drivers at risk of attacks from extreme right thugs, quote-unquote, who had infiltrated these taxi protests, and they were, quote-unquote, spoiling for a fight. Kalanick, though, appeared to urge his team to press ahead regardless. Quote, I think it's worth it. Violence guarantees success, and that these guys must be resisted. No, agreed that right place and time must be thought out. Now, the decision to send Uber drivers into potentially volatile protests, despite the risks, was consistent with what one senior former executive told The Guardian and was a strategy of, quote, quote-unquote, weaponizing drivers and exploiting violence against them to, and I quote, keep the controversy burning. It was a playbook that leaked emails suggested was repeated in Italy, Belgium, Spain, Switzerland, and also the Netherlands, when masked men reported to be angry taxi drivers turned on Uber drivers with knuckle dusters, which I'm assuming is the UK version of brass knuckles, and a hammer in Amsterdam. In March of 2015, Uber staffers sought to turn it to their advantage to win concessions from the Dutch government. Driver victims were encouraged to file police reports, which were shared with De Telegraaf, which was a leading Dutch daily newspaper. They, quote, will be published without our fingerprint on the front page tomorrow, end quote, according to one Uber manager. Quote, we keep the violence narrative going for a few days before we offer the solution. So, in other words, they're basically saying, hey, Uber driver, you're just trying to make a living driving this Uber. Why don't you go out there? Why don't you go and counter-protest? Why don't you go put yourself in harm's way on our behalf? You don't see Kalanick out there taking lumps from knuckle dusters, whatever those are, and there we are. Now, Kalanick's spokesperson questioned now the authenticity of some of these documents. She said, Kalanick, quote, never suggested that Uber should take advantage of violence at the expense of driver safety, end quote, and any suggestion that he was involved in such activity would be, quote, completely false, end quote. I personally think this is covering, given what we know, and we will talk about that very shortly. Now, Uber drivers were undoubtedly the target of vicious assaults and sometimes murders by taxi drivers, obviously very angry given the change and disruption in essentially that economy. And Uber also, basically the app itself in some countries found itself battling entrenched and basically with entrenched and monopolized taxi fleets with cozy relationships with city authorities. There you go. Uber often characterized its opponents in the regulated taxi markets as operating a quote-unquote cartel. That was part of their marketing strategy, if I recall, to basically say, oh, these taxi cartels are screwing you. It's like $20 to get to the airport in a taxi, $15 in an Uber, come help out your neighbor who's driving, you to the airport, whatever that is. However, though, privately, Uber executives and staffers appear to have been in little doubt about the often rogue nature of their own operations. In internal emails, staff referred to Uber's, quote, other than legal status, end quote, or other forms of active non-compliance with regulations in countries including Turkey, South Africa, Spain, the Czech Republic, Sweden, France, Germany, and even Russia. One senior executive wrote in an email, quote, we are not legal in many countries. We should avoid making antagonistic statements, end quote, commenting on the tactics the company was prepared to deploy to, quote unquote, avoid enforcement. Another executive wrote, quote, we have officially become pirates, end quote. Now, Neri Hordaijian, and I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, I apologize if I'm not, that person was Uber's head of global communications, put it even more bluntly, in a message to a colleague in 2014 amid efforts to shut the company down in Thailand and India. And I quote, sometimes we have problems because, well, we're just effing illegal, end quote. Contacted by The Guardian, that individual declined to comment. Across the world, police, transport officials, and regulatory agencies had sought to clamp down on Uber, and in some cities, officials that were downloading the app in some cities to hail rides so that they could crack down on unlicensed taxi journeys. Finding Uber drivers and impounding their cars was kind of the name of the game. Uber offices in dozens of countries were oftentimes repeatedly raided by local authorities as well. Now, against that backdrop, Uber developed sophisticated methods to thwart law enforcement. One of these was known internally as the Uber, quote-unquote, kill switch. When an Uber office was raided, executives at the company frantically sent out instructions to IT to cut off access to the company's main data systems, preventing authorities from gathering evidence. Now, the leaked files suggest the technique was signed off on by Uber's lawyers, was deployed at least 12 times during the raids in France, the Netherlands, Belgium, India, Hungary, and Romania. Politicians now are also facing questions about whether they took direction from Uber executives. When a French police official in 2015 appeared to ban one of Uber's services in Marseille, McGann, Uber's chief lobbyist in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, the whistleblower, turned to Uber's ally in the French cabinet. I will look at this personally, Macron texted back, quote, at this point, let's stay calm, meaning they were getting essentially not the local police officials, they were getting the minister of the economy at that time. Obviously, Macron, now the president, as I mentioned. So this completely, and again, this is not the full article. I paraphrase and quoted heavily here. It's such a good article. There's so much more that they wrote, but this completely aligns with the years of negative reports about Uber and their founder, Travis Kalanick. Now, some of the headlines that I went searching for as I was putting this together, and this is one of my longer videos / podcasts, listen to this headline from CNBC, August of 2017. Former Uber exec charged in hacking cover-up, prosecutors say. Joseph Sullivan, who was Uber's former chief security officer, was charged then in federal court on allegations that he arranged to pay hackers $100,000 to cover up essentially the high-tech heist that stole the personal information of about 57 million Uber passengers. That's obviously a huge problem, not to mention the drivers as well. That was in 2016. They basically kept that quiet. It broke in 2017. And so my credit card, your credit card, if you've ever used Uber, was essentially dumped out into the ether. We don't know what exactly happened with that, but they tried to not be transparent. They tried to cover this up, exposing all of us when we could have had a year to take time to, let's say, protect our credit if it's the first time we were part of a data breach. Now it's becoming more commonplace, but back then it was still a pretty big thing. That's around the era of Equifax as well. Or how about this BBC headline from June 21st of 2017? The scandals that drove Travis Kalanick at, and some of these are crazy. In a widely reported email to staff ahead of the company party in Miami of 2013, Mr. Kalanick, known as TK, asked employees not to have sex with each other if they were in the, quote, same chain of command, end quote, or not to throw beer kegs off tall buildings, and levied a $200 quote-unquote puke charge for anybody who was sick, presumably as a result of overindulgence of alcohol. It's also been claimed that Mr. Kalanick saw the medical records of a woman who had accused an Uber driver of rape in India after they were obtained by Uber Asia executive Eric Alexander. Obviously, that's a very deeply personal thing. And then in February of 2017, a blog post by former Uber engineer engineer Susan J. Fowler basically documented her experiences with sexism at Uber. That went viral. Obviously, that was a huge problem. That was part of the erosion of corporate culture that started to come out during this era. Now, during an interview with the magazine GQ in 2014, Mr. Kalanick joked about a service for women on demand, which he named Boober, like Uber, but boobs. I mean, seriously, this guy is basically a frat bro, because there's a ton of other incidents when it comes to basically women and objectification, all those kinds of things, but you get the gist of that. Now, moving beyond that, there's a heck of a lot more, because the New York Times revealed that it had been using Uber had been using a computer program called Greyball, which it claimed had been used to identify officials trying to catch its drivers and deny them service in areas where Uber had not yet been authorized. If you recall, I mentioned they had been raided. Basically some officials around the globe were trying to get Ubers so that they could basically fine and sanction Uber. And so Uber was looking at them specifically to essentially lock them down. Now, Uber also said that the program had been used to prevent quote-unquote fraudulent users from violating its terms, but it was also reported that Apple CEO Tim Cook had personally intervened when his company had discovered Uber had been using quote-unquote fingerprinting code to track iPhones by collecting their serial numbers, which is against the terms of the App Store. Basically, Uber was taking information from your phone and storing it in their servers. That is a huge violation of your privacy. It's another reason why, and I remember that, and I talked about that back in the day. That was a huge, obvious crazy issue. Now, Uber claimed that the process deterred criminals from installing its app on stolen handsets, but come on, dude, really? No, I'm sorry. Now, Waymo, which is obviously the self-driving car firm owned by Google's parent Alphabet, and obviously they have the app as well, don't get me wrong, they accuse Uber of stealing their trade secrets. In court, Waymo alleged that Anthony Lewandowski, a former employee, downloaded 14,000 confidential files before leaving the company in 2016 and then later joining Uber to head up its self-driving car project. Uber denies receiving stolen technology. Then in 2017, Kalanick was caught on video arguing with an Uber driver about fares in the actual car that the Uber driver was driving, meaning he got an Uber and the Uber driver knew who he was, and there you go. When the ride ended, driver Fauzi Kamel took the opportunity to share a common driver complaint. Quote, and this is on video, you can watch it, quote, "You're raising the standards and you're dropping the prices." The pair then discussed the state of the ride-hail market for a few moments before Kamel drove his point home. Quote, "People are not trusting you anymore. I lost $97,000 because of you. I'm bankrupt because of you. You keep changing every day." Now, Kalanick denied that the prices for Uber's high-end service, known as Uber Black, had fallen that much, saying or telling Mr. Kamel that's BS, although he says bull, Now, he got personal then with Kamel as well. Quote, "Some people don't like to take responsibility for their own blank. They blame everyone else in their life on somebody else. Good luck." And then he slammed the door and walked away, and on and on and on and on. There's also been multiple articles and analysis on how the gig economy has been rather bad overall for employees, although that is a mixed bag. But some of the articles I found that I'm not going to dive into are, and again, essentially the gig economy was spearheaded by Uber. The gig economy is what it is today because of Uber's massive presence, oftentimes illegally growing in a lot of places. But some of the articles that I found that I read through when I was doing my homework on this are, and I quote one, "How the gig economy is ruining our lives." Here's another one, "How the gig economy profits off desperation." Another one, "It's time to destroy the gig economy." Now, that said, many stats also disagree with those headlines and show that many workers are happy with some aspects of the gig economy, but it's a bit of a mixed bag. I'm going to let you decide on that one. I do not want hate mail saying, "Nick, you suck for hating the gig economy," or vice versa. I'm not adjudicating that. I am simply tying all of the negative together for Uber, and that obviously I think is a huge problem. We have a very serious problem with this company, especially if they've done things that are blatantly illegal. And 124,000 documents literally show that. Now, I understand, and I've got to be honest with you, they're under new management. They have been since about 2016, 2017, and I'm not saying that the new boss and culture is that of the old, but They, as an organization, have to own their past mistakes. Uber cannot be allowed to go unchecked here with things like this. It's a huge problem. And how many of those people that were under Kalanick are now under the new boss? And if there is no real understanding at the very top of the leadership, just how deep and just how bad this goes, they could still be having business as usual, basically pushing out the tactics that they would be considered, successful, but not necessarily ethical. And that is something that we really have to understand. The buck stops with the CEO, but at the same token, CEOs have to delegate. The CEO is not basically talking to that local mayor to try to get something done. You've got people to do that for you. You expect them to do it in the way that you oversee, but that doesn't necessarily mean it happens that way. These are things that I think are a huge problem. I think the FTC, probably the SEC, not to mention a whole bunch of European countries and looks like, Australia, New Zealand, Asian countries, Thailand, India, South Africa, et cetera, basically need to start investigating exactly what happened. This is a huge problem. And I'm not necessarily saying that Uber or ride sharing like this, Uber, Lyft, take your pick, is a bad thing. But obviously, if it's this disruptive and they're using unethical tactics to get themselves wedged into the door, that's a huge problem. And so there you go. Obviously, this was a longer video, but again, fantastic reporting by The Guardian. I urge all of you to go read that. This is unconscionable. And if you're using Uber, please explain to me why at this point, when there are other alternatives out there, such as Cab, such as Lyft, such as, whatever it is. I mean, we don't have to use Uber. And I haven't since, again, 2017. Once I heard they lied and covered up a data breach, I was done. I've never used them since, and I won't. Just moving forward, this really solidifies it. They lost my trust, and until they can prove that they've got it back, and I'm nowhere near that, here we are. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP, and please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private. Thanks, everyone.